The Sacramento Kings lost to the worst team in the league last night, that team being, of course, the Washington Wizards. As a Kings fan, does not feel great. And to make matters worse, Dallas and Phoenix both won last night, so the Kings now find themselves back in the 8th seed. This was obviously a horrible loss for the Kings for a multitude of reasons, but is it the worst loss of the season? No, but only because they have a pretty long list of really bad losses, especially at home. This one was on the road, but I think the Kings have now lost to 4 teams this season who don't have 20 wins yet. That's not good. That's a lot. But it got me thinking, do other playoff contenders have bad losses? I mean, obviously everybody has a stinker every once in a while, but I'm talking like, does the rest of the West struggle against lottery teams the same way the Kings do? And if they do, is it to the same extent as the Kings? So, what I did was, I looked at the top 10 teams in the West. Sorry, Rockets, you weren't included, although I will be talking about you a decent amount later. Anyway, top 10 teams in the West, OKC all the way down to Golden State. I looked at each of these teams' schedules and counted up what I considered to be their bad losses. And I'll be honest, the rubric, if you will, that I used to determine what exactly a bad loss was admittedly pretty subjective. And obviously, the idea of a bad loss is subjective in itself, so I didn't want to worry too much about creating a metric or something like that. So essentially, what I did was I looked at a team schedule on ESPN and I looked at all the games the team has played this season and I looked to see if said team had losses against any of the bottom 5 teams in either conference. Seems pretty fair, right? If you're a playoff contender and you see one of these bottom 5 teams on the schedule, you're expecting to win. And so if you end up losing to that bottom 5 team, that's more than likely a bad loss. Now, obviously, there's other factors to consider, like if it was a road game, maybe it was a back-to-back, there's injuries to account for, there's a lot of stuff. And I'll be honest, I didn't really look too deep into it. The Kings, I kind of just remember what was going on before, during, and after those games. I remember all the external factors for the most part, but that's because I watched pretty much every Kings game. I do not watch every New Orleans Pelicans game, believe it or not. So, if you are a Pelicans fan and somehow found this channel and continued to watch for this long, I apologize if I call one of your losses a bad loss, even though Trey Murphy missed that game because he slept in or whatever. Okay, so everybody good? Everybody on the same page? Good. Let's see if other fan bases are just as miserable as us. Us being the Kings, obviously. The channel's called Like the Beam. You'd understand. Okay, let's get into it. The Oklahoma City Thunder. They've lost to the Kings on the road twice. Not necessarily bad losses, but I just want to throw that in there. They lost to the Rockets on the road, lost in Atlanta and Brooklyn in back-to-back games on the road, lost to Detroit, you guessed it, on the road, and also lost to San Antonio on the road. They also got swept in the season series to the Lakers, who, I will be talking about later. They are in this video. I don't know if you guys consider that a bad loss, but I feel like a 1 seed losing to a 9 or 10 seed, I put it in the video, so I guess it is a bad loss. Overall, though, there's no real bad losses at home. The only true bad losses were against the Pistons and Spurs. But, they've taken care of business for the most part, beaten some really good teams, hence, why they are the 1 seed. Moving on to the 2 seed Denver Nuggets, they have lost to the Kings 3 times. Again, not necessarily bad losses, just want to flex a little bit. They also lost to Houston 3 times. Hey, just like the Kings. Lost to Orlando twice. Not bad, just interesting. Overall, they took care of business at home, very similar to the Thunder. Their worst loss of the season is probably versus Utah, which, Utah they have talent, but, these guys were the champs for a reason, Similar to the Celtics, they don't really have bad losses. As for the Minnesota Timberwolves, who find themselves in the 3 seed, they lost in Toronto and Atlanta in 2 of the first 3 games of the season, lost to Sacramento twice. Sorry, I wrote these notes before before I recorded this, and I guess I just really wanted everybody to know that the Kings have a pretty good record against the top 3 seeds in the West. Anyway, they lost to Charlotte at home. That's an actual bad loss. Lost to San Antonio on the road. Both of those games, the Charlotte game and the San Antonio game, I should mention, were 1-possession games. So, that stuff happens. They lost to Chicago in OT. So, this is another great home team They don't really lose a ton on their home floor except when it's against the Kings. They also have the best road record as well, and it's just really unfortunate that Cat is hurt, and I mean he should be back for playoffs and stuff, but who knows if he'll be 100%. Either way, they're one of the best teams in the league, and even their bad losses, like they could have very easily won those games. So yeah, moving on to the 4 seed Los Angeles Clippers. They started the year 3-7, and since then don't really have any bad losses like at all. At the time of this recording, they are about to play Portland, and if they somehow lose, that'll obviously be a bad loss. But yeah, no real bad losses except the fact that they lost at home to the Kings. Just gonna keep throwing that out there. Sorry if you're not a Kings fan and watching this. For whatever reason, it's important for me that you guys know this. And the Clippers also just got blown out by Atlanta at home earlier this week. And I consider that kind of their only bad loss, even though Atlanta is probably going to be a playoff team, or at least a play-in team. But yeah, the Clippers, another super solid team, potential title contenders. You get the idea. The 5 seed New Orleans Pelicans. So they got blown out at home versus Golden State, the third game of the year. They also got blown out by Atlanta at home a few games later. Lost back-to-back games in Utah. Lost to the Bulls in Chicago. Lost to Memphis twice, but the first loss was by 2 and the second one was by 1. Both of those are more so just tough losses than like bad losses, but either way, loss is a loss, especially for the sake of this video. They also lost to the Bulls in New Orleans. Their record versus the Kings is irrelevant. Overall, a rough start to the year, but they've been pretty consistent since. And, Zion is playing like Zion of old, even though, he was still one of the best players in the league even like a year or two ago. But I'm glad to see that he's kind of found his stride again. And a weird little tidbit about the Pelicans, they are better on the road than they are at home. And I think they're one of those sneaky playoff teams that you probably don't want to see come playoff time. Now we got the 6 seed Dallas Mavericks, and they lost to Toronto at home, Memphis at home, got blown out by Utah, blown out by Memphis, blown out by the Pacers twice. Not bad, just kind of interesting. And then they're also 0-2 versus the Kings so far. Overall, no real like terrible losses, although 2 losses to Memphis is pretty tough, especially considering the fact that they're in a little bit of a race for that 6 seed, maybe even 5 seed with, the Pelicans, Kings, Suns. I guess the Lakers and Warriors are back there too, but I feel like they've kind of separated themselves from those 2 teams. Mainly it's really just the Mavericks, Suns, and Kings fighting for that 6 seed. They're all within a half game of each other. So you'd like to have those games against Memphis back. But we're going to move on to the Suns, who are currently the 7 seed. They would be in the play-in tournament if the season ended today. Now, the Suns lost back-to-back games against the Spurs. And the Spurs, I believe, have won 11 games since then. So that's pretty tough. They also lost in Toronto, lost at home versus the Nets, lost in Portland, lost at home versus Memphis, lost in Atlanta, lost in the Bay, and they've lost twice to the Rockets. And I keep bringing up the Rockets. They are the 11th seed, so they are technically a bottom 5 team, but they've won like 7 in a row and are very close to overtaking the Warriors for that 10 seed. So like, watch out for the Rockets. That is a team, especially if I were the Kings, that I would not want to see in the play-in tournament in like a win or go home situation. They would scare me a lot. But back to the Suns. Overall, they're obviously a very talented team. I don't think anybody has a better top 3 players than they do, but their production hasn't really matched their talent this year. Obviously, they've struggled with injuries and stuff, but yeah, I mean, that's not a team I would necessarily want to see in the playoffs either. And I think that's just kind of the theme of this entire Western Conference, is that every team, even like 1 through 12, you can make an argument for, super talented and could win on like any given night. But as far as the Suns go, they have 4 losses versus the bottom 3 teams in the West. That's pretty tough. But speaking of tough, let's talk about the Sacramento Kings, which are the reason I made this video in the first place. So if we go back to the start of the year, the Kings were 2-4 with 2 losses versus the Rockets and 2 losses versus the Warriors. In 2018 that wouldn't be bad at all, but in 2024 it kind of is. considering that is the 10 and 11 seed. But after that start, we won 6 straight and then lost 2 in a row to the Pelicans. So 6 losses versus 3 teams to start the year. None of them were horrible losses. Like, I'm sure when Kings fans are thinking back to the worst losses of the season, none of those probably even make the list. So I guess we should actually talk about the bad losses. Kings were blown out by the Blazers in Portland. I think that was kind of the first time that the Kings were like, "Whoa, hey, now that wasn't very fun." And then we lost to Charlotte at home soon after. Then we had blown leads in back-to-back games versus the Bucks and the Suns. And yes, those were really tough losses, but it's not really fair because for the sake of this video, those aren't really considered bad losses because they were against good teams. And I'm sure every fan of every team I've mentioned so far could tell me about a loss they had this year against a good team that they wish they could have back. But, that's not what this video is about. Kings also lost to the Pacers without Halliburton at home. But, again, like, I'm not going to go through every single game and check the box score or injury report to see who wasn't playing. I just know that was a bad loss because I watched the game. And I'll be honest, probably 80 to 90% of like the full NBA games that I watch are Kings games. I try to watch every Kings game I can. Only time I really miss a game is if I'm at work or at a family function, but even then, I'm probably holding my phone under the table and watching League Pass that way. So yeah, that's why I'm rattling off these bad losses that we as Kings fans know are bad losses, but they're not necessarily bad when you just look back at the schedule. But anyway, moving on. The Kings also lost to Detroit at home. They lost to Chicago at home and are 0-3 versus Houston, which, doesn't look as bad now that Houston has won 7 straight and are only a couple games back of the plan. But yeah, man, that's including last night on the road versus Washington, which, was a second night of a back to back, I should mention, but, still, you got to win that game. That's like, I mean, we've lost to the 3 worst teams in the East. And I mean, Portland's essentially like the worst team. I know like Spurs probably have a worse record, but they have Wemby. So, who would you rather be? But yeah, that's the Kings. I'll get back to them at the end of the video because I have a little more to say about them. But I want to move on to the Lakers and the Warriors. First up, we got the Lakers, who are the 9 seed. They've lost in San Antonio, in Chicago, at home versus Memphis, in Utah. They also lost at home versus the Nets and were blown out by the Hawks. They also got swept in the season series versus the Kings. Just got to throw that in there. Only second time that's ever happened. Overall, kind of what I expected. They have some bad losses to bad teams. If you check out the schedule, they also have some great wins versus good teams. So, like, a little bit of, best of both worlds there. Jekyll and Hyde, if you will. But, it's crazy because they're like 6 or 7 games above 500. They might be more like 5. I don't know why I'm not looking at the standings right now. I guess it's because it's the Lakers and it's LeBron James that the narrative around them is that they're kind of a bad team. I don't know. We'll see what happens come playoff time. Or I guess in their case, playing time. But moving on to the Warriors. They lost versus Toronto, lost at Memphis, lost in Atlanta, lost at home versus Chicago, and lost at home versus San Antonio. They're 2-2 versus the Kings. I mentioned the Kings with every other team, so figured I'd do it here as well. Overall, though, they've really just gotten beat up by the best of the West. They can't beat, OKC or Minnesota or Denver or even the Clippers. They were hot for a minute, but they've cooled off a bit now. But I still feel like that's not a team you want to see, at least in like a win or go home situation, because Steph can drop 50 at any given point. And, they still have like Chris Paul, Draymond, Clay, a lot of vets, and obviously a great coach too. So, yeah, that 9-10 game against the Lakers is going to be crazy, as long as, the Rockets don't sneak in there. But yeah, since I am a Kings channel, I'm going to end this video kind of talking about how the Kings play into all of this, So if you're not a Kings fan, I appreciate you watching this far. I'll let you go. You have permission to click out of this video now. Just make sure before you do, drop a like, maybe even subscribe. And if you feel so inclined, leave a comment. Tell me what you think about this video I just made. But yeah, real quick, just about the Kings, man. They probably do have the most bad losses out of the top 10 teams in the West, but I don't think it's by like a super wide margin, especially compared to the teams that are directly near them in the standings, like the Lakers, Warriors, Mavericks, Suns. Uh, the Clippers and Nuggets stand out to me as the teams that have handled their business the best. I mean, I guess the Thunder too. But for the most part, those teams have beaten the teams they should beat. I think that's why we'll most likely see them in the Western Conference Finals. The Nuggets are still the favorites to me. They're like in a tier of their own. But, directly below them are the Clippers, probably in a tier of their own too. And then it's kind of the rest of the West, in my opinion. You can make just as strong a case for a playing team reaching the Western Conference Finals as you can any of those other top six teams, not named Clippers and Nuggets. And y'all might think that's disrespectful to the Thunder and Wolves, but those teams are extremely talented. But I see them kind of the same way I saw the Kings last year. Very capable of going on a run, but if they get a bad matchup in round one, they could get bounced pretty quick. I think they'll put up a fight against anyone, same way I thought the Kings would have last year. The Warriors were like the worst matchup for the Kings, in my opinion, and we still took them to 7 games. Okay, Denver was actually the worst, obviously, but I still do believe very strongly that if we would have beaten the Warriors, the Lakers series would have actually been easier, and I think we would have reached the conference finals. And just imagine how different the narrative would be right now around this team. Not that like we wouldn't have gotten swept by the Nuggets too. I we probably would have, but we would have still won 2 playoff series against Steph Curry and LeBron James. Pretty freaking crazy for a team who hadn't been to the playoffs in 16 years. Anyway, I'm rambling. The Wolves or Thunder could very easily make it to the Western Conference Finals, but they could just as easily get bounced in the first round. So, in conclusion, the Kings have some very bad losses on the year. That's pretty obvious. But, every team has those every once in a while. You just gotta hope those losses don't come back to bite you come the last day of the season. But, for every bad loss the Kings have, I can point to 1 or 2 really good wins. And that's what's kept them alive in the playoff hunt. The other side to that is, if the Kings took care of business, especially on their home court, they'd be in that fight for home court advantage. Like a 3 or 4 seed. But because of their inconsistencies, they have firmly established themselves as a very solid playoff team, who might be able to win a series, maybe even 2 if everything went right for them. But, we just got to wait and see what happens. We got 13 games left. Let's take care of business. Go Kings, light the beam.